Today's presentation is part of the Nathan E. Cohen Lecture Series. The lecture series was started back in 1989 by the great man, Dr. Arthur Cohen, right here. At the synagogue, we just call him the Great One. Ever since then, and I've been a part of the lecture series since 1989. Ever since then, we've had around 4 lectures per year on many different subjects. It's been a nice way to invite our friends, Jewish and non-Jewish, to our synagogue. I know that nobody came here today to hear me speak, so I'd like to now introduce today's speaker. I've known Paul for a very long time. He taught at Keene State for 32 years, directed the Mason Library, served as a director of the Cohen Center for Holocaust Studies for 9 years, and Paul was involved with coordinating, founding, and then serving as the first chair of the Holocaust and Genocide Studies program at Keene State. Paul also won Keene State's Distinguished Teaching Award in 2008. Paul received a fellowship at the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, and also received a Fulbright Award in 2015 to teach at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland. Could I introduce my friend, Dr. Paul Vincent?
Great, thanks. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. And Paul is much older than he was when he used to teach full time, so just warn you. Today is a special day to some degree because it's only 2 days after the liberation of Auschwitz, a date that is now marked as an international memorial to the Holocaust, the date on which the Red Army came and liberated Auschwitz. And I had the privilege of being there in 2015 when I had my Fulbright and was able to be at the ceremony, which was quite special. If you're at all familiar with that camp, and I know many of you have probably been over there, but Birkenau has a very large gate. And the tent in which we were, remember this is in January and there was snow on the ground and it was quite cold, the tent actually enclosed that entire gate, and it was remarkable to see that gate, which then started to look very small by comparison. And we're not talking about the gate that says Arbeit macht frei. We're talking about the gate through which the trains were able to take in the people that were then selected on the other side. So that was 78 years ago now that happened. Equally important, and not something that people are talking about, and maybe we'll hear a bit more about it tomorrow, is tomorrow represents the 90th anniversary of Hitler's appointment as chancellor, 30th of January, 1933. And I think that's something we need to remember as well, because that started the ball rolling. Hitler and the Nazis were fond of calling it the Machtergreifung, the seizure of power. And it's gone down in history as the Machtergreifung. It's not a good term. It was the Machtübergabe, the giving of power. The Machtübergabe, giving power to Hitler. Something that the president was convinced to do. Paul von Hindenburg had resisted doing this for more than a half year at this point. But finally, he gave in to pressure from conservatives who felt they could control Hitler. We'll have him boxed in a corner, they thought. Terrible mistake. That's not what I'm going to talk about today, but I thought it was important to bring to mind that is another anniversary that is terribly important for the world to remember. On the 8th of May, 1945, this is the official date of Nazi Germany's surrender. meaning this is marked as VE Day, Victory in Europe in the Second World War. An American soldier, a Quaker who happened to be a medic, was driving by in a Jeep when he noticed a young boy, boy turned out to be 13 years old, lying by the side of the road. This was close to a camp called Gunskirchen, which had been liberated 4 days before. Gunskirchen was a satellite camp, a sub-camp, a fairly large one of the concentration camp known as Mauthausen. This is in Austria. The Quaker went and he picked up the boy, put him in his Jeep, more dead than alive, and he took him to a local hospital, where at gunpoint, he ordered the physician to take care of him, saying, I'll come back and check in on the boy, who, as a young Jew, this was a boy who was born in September of 1931, might just as well have been murdered either by the doctor or by the hospital staff, because of the date when this is and the fact that he was Jewish, and he ensured that didn't happen. The boy's name, this is going to work, I have to turn it on. The boy's name was Zev. He had been born and raised in a traditional Jewish home in northeast Austria. In fact, his home was right in this area here, between these two communities. So it was probably, it was a village, a small town where he was. Now, he in June of 1944, together with his parents, with a sister and a brother, Zev was deported with thousands of Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz-Birkenau. They were 5 of 438,000 Jews, Hungarian Jews, who were deported between the 15th of May and the 9th of July, 1944. 90% of these Jews were murdered, okay, in the greatest killing frenzy that Auschwitz witnessed during its entire history. Indeed, his parents and his sister were murdered upon arrival, and his younger brother died just a few days later. Zev was among the lucky, and I use lucky in quotation marks, amongst the lucky 10% who were deemed capable of labor. He was assigned to a forced labor crew, along with other adolescents. An older prisoner was put in charge of this work detail. And this is where he is then in June of 44. Now, how did Zev wind up at a Mauthausen subcamp 11 months later? What happened between his transport to Auschwitz and his being found on an Austrian roadside 11 months later? In a way, that's what I aim to cover today. It's not a happy story. It's by no means a redemptive story, but it's an important piece of Nazi Germany's history and an important piece of the Second World War. Now, as an introduction to what I want to talk about, I think some footnotes are necessary. To whom do I really owe this talk? I don't deem myself a specialist in the Nazi concentration camp system. That doesn't mean I don't know a lot about it, but specialists are somebody who devote virtually single-minded attention to this. As an undergraduate professor at a college, which is largely a four-year college, history professors are not specialists. I specialized more in American immigration policy during the 1930s up until the opening of the war itself. So what I share today, I largely owe to 3 scholars. Nicholas Waxman, who is I would say largely regarded as the go-to person when it comes to anything dealing with Nazi concentration camps. Waxman is a German, and he's a professor at the University of London. He's the author, above all, of a book called KL, A History of the Nazi Concentration Camps. KL is a diminutive of Konzentrationslager. So it's the concentration camps. He is currently at work on a comprehensive history of Auschwitz, just Auschwitz itself. Secondly is Karen Ort. Karen Ort is a German historian at the University of Freiburg. Most of her work is in German. She has a book called Das System, der Nationalsozialistische Konzentrationskampfslager, which is a history of the system of concentration camps. But she contributed an absolutely fabulous article, which is the introduction to a vast encyclopedia that's being done by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And you can see that listed here as part of the bibliographic entry. Her analysis of the social structure of the camps is groundbreaking. Finally, there's Daniel Blattman. Blattman is an Israeli history professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His key work to date is on the death marches. This is the final phase of Nazi genocide, which is the subtitle of his work. I have to say that the death marches are an integral part of the collapse of the concentration camp system in Germany. So, to begin, what do I mean by the word camp? Now, this is I owe this to myself, although the three people I've mentioned would no doubt agree with me. The Nazis had camps that were transit camps. They had camps for detention. They had camps for persecution. They had camps for forced labor. They had camps for extermination during the Third Reich. And by the way, this is not to mention camps for the Volksgemeinschaft, which means camp for the average Aryan German, which were a part, obviously, also of the Nazi system. Not dissimilar, I suspect, to going to a summer camp in the United States today. But that's another story. So care must be used in distinguishing between Nazi camps. And you'll get a sense of this when we go into the vastness of this. Death is a product of every Nazi camp when it comes to the Nazi camps that are not Volksgemeinschaft camps, okay? But not every camp was an extermination camp. So we need to understand the difference here. I think it's important. Auschwitz, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek, or sometimes referred to as the Lublin camp, Sobibor, Treblinka. These are camps designed purely for killing, that is extermination. That is their purpose. Okay? Yet two of these, Auschwitz and Majdanek, were more than extermination camps. Indeed, they were not established as extermination camps. They were established as concentration camps. Okay? They evolve. They become more than what they were originally designed to be. And Chelmno is really not a camp at all. It is more a point of mass extermination. And a place where they would kill people in gas vans and then ship them out to have their bodies burned or buried in a forest nearby. So one might call Dachau a death camp, and I hear that very often. And indeed, death was widespread in Dachau, without question. As it was in Buchenwald, as it was in Bergen-Belsen, as it was in many other places whose names that you've heard. But one needs to recognize the difference here. Concentration camps were not designed for mass murder. It doesn't mean that murder didn't take place there, but that was not the principle behind them. Now, with this distinction in mind, there's another key point that needs to be known. The concentration camps were not established for Jews. They weren't established for Jews from the outset. That is, from 1933 to roughly the end of 1936, the camps were for political prisoners. Hitler and the Nazis were far from secure in the early stages, and for good reasons. If you take the two working class parties, the Social Democrats and the Communist parties, they outnumbered at the polls the Nazis. So there were plenty of people in the German home front that were opposed to the Nazis. And to be sure, there were Jews in the camps. And those Jews were brutalized in ways that were very often different from those that weren't Jews. But they were not incarcerated because they were Jews. They were incarcerated because they were social democrats or communists, or maybe Democrats who were beholden to the Weimar Republic, which is now being replaced in 1933. Now, from 1937, Heinrich Himmler earmarked other threats to the Nazi regime. You know, we basically have handled the problem of political prisoners. You know, they're either dead, or they have fled the country, or they as a result of incarceration, they are so intimidated they're not going to be a problem for us anymore. Okay? But we still need the camps. And Himmler went out of his way to make sure that Hitler felt this need to keep the concentration camp not only going, but thriving. So at the outset, he identifies 2,000 so-called professional or habitual criminals. People who were, in some cases, they were simply petty thieves. But they were identified as being problems, and consequently, they were incarcerated. Asocial. What does it mean to be an asocial? This is a catch-all. This is a catch-all term that the Nazis used for anything that seemed to be deviant. Deviant behavior. Jehovah's Witnesses. Jehovah's Witnesses they might be wonderfully perfect Aryans, but if they weren't ready to go seek Heil or Heil Hitler, it's a problem, and they weren't going to do that. Homosexuals, men. That doesn't mean that in some instances women didn't get caught up in this, but the major focus, and this says something I think about the Nazi regime, the major focus was on men. And then the work shy. This was an effort that was made in 1938. There were 10,000 arrests made in what was called Action Work shy Reich, June of 1938. The arrest of people who were vagrants, who were pimps, people who were beggars, or people who were itinerant workers and simply were not trustworthy because they were going from job to job. Now, of course, I haven't mentioned the gypsies because the gypsies could also fit in that category. Okay, and they were, in fact, a part of this. But in any case, this led to a transformation of the concentration camp system. The population now, by the middle of 1938, as a consequence of that final act, the action against the work shy, suddenly political prisoners represent only 43% of the population in the camps. Yet we have to see that these people are deemed a problem for the Volksgemeinschaft. Keep in mind, as you look at these categories, that the Nazis are aiming to create a master race. Can you have a master race with work shy? Can you have a master race with homosexuals? Can you have a master race with anybody who is deemed deviant? And this gives you some background, I think, that is necessary when you start to think about what's going to happen next. Now, The concentration camp, I keep using that term, and I want to just make sure that you understand what it is. Volksgemeinschaft, obviously a German term, is a combination of two words. Gemeinschaft means community, and Volk means people. For the Nazis, Volk meant more than people. It meant it had a racial designation to it. To be part of the Volksgemeinschaft is going to exclude a lot of people that simply can't fit that category. But it was a very popular word in Nazi Germany. Now, the concentration camp numbers remain relatively small prior to the outbreak of the war. At the end of 1937, in fact, there were only 7,700 men in Dachau, Sachsenhausen, and Buchenwald. Those are the three main camps at that point. Ravensbrück is about to be created for women. It's going to be a strictly women camp. This climbs in July of 1938 to 22,000, so a fairly significant jump. But by the end of the year, 1938, it has jumped to 50,000. And the reason it's jumped to 50,000 is that Kristallnacht on the 9th and 10th of November of 38 transforms the camp population. Approximately 28,000 Jewish men are arrested. Okay? And now suddenly, by the end of 1938, Jews are the largest component in the concentration camps. Now, I want to be careful in making sure that you recognize that the aim here is not to put them in camps. It is to terrorize the Jews, to get their families, to find some way to get the family out of the country. We don't want to keep them in camps. Okay? So the idea is not to incarcerate them permanently in concentration camps. And it's certainly not at this point to annihilate them. Now, by the beginning of the war, the 1st of September 1939, what you find is moving Jews not into camps, but into ghettos with the invasion of Poland. Okay? And ghettos were always deemed to be an intermediate thing. This is why most ghettos were established near rail lines, so that shipment someplace else was going to be easily available. And that doesn't mean, at least at the outset, taking them to annihilation camps. It means at the outset, potentially shipping them ultimately all the way back to Siberia once the Soviet Union collapses. Hitler knew all the way from 1939, even though he's made a pact with Stalin, that he's going to eventually invade the Soviet Union. And of course, you don't go to war expecting to lose. Okay? So you make plans for the future. Now, I want to say that in the 4 months after Kristallnacht, more people died in Dachau than in the previous roughly 9 years. 6 years, excuse me. More people died in 4 months than 6 years, and the reason was you had 22,000 Jews now in the camps. Now, I think of equal import, the sheer vastness of the camp system really needs to be noted. No doubt, everybody here knows certain names that are associated with a concentration camp system. Dachau, Buchenwald, Auschwitz, these are names that I think virtually everybody knows. Some are apt to recognize several more. Sachsenhausen, Bergen-Belsen, Mauthausen, Ravensbrück. I've mentioned a couple of these already. Finally, a few of you might be aware of other names. Stutthof. Stutthof was a camp up by Danzig, or what we now know as Gdansk, to the east of that city. Bergen-Belsen, Mittelbau Dora rather. This was a camp that was established in Thuringia in order to build V-2 rockets. Tunnels were driven into the Harz Mountains here in order to build these rockets. It was a horrible place. Gross-Rosen was a major camp just to the west of Breslau. So it's in Lower Silesia, and it's a camp that that was much more massive than people recognize. Płotzów, if you've seen Schindler's List, Płotzów was made famous as a camp that was just outside of Krakow, where Amon Gut supposedly took his rifle and picked off people that were in the camp. If you've seen the movie, you're familiar with that. But I'm guessing that very few, if any of you, have ever heard of Arlsen, of Elsnig, of Tachau. There was both a men's and a women's camp with that name, or Wansleben. These are all subcamps by 1945 of Buchenwald. They are all names of small towns and villages in Germany, generally, but not entirely, in the area of Buchenwald, which is very close to Weimar. Indeed, Buchenwald alone had 130 subcamps. It had subcamps of subcamps. Every name that you know, from Auschwitz to Sachsenhausen, every name that you know had subcamps by 1944, either a handful or more than 100. Dachau's subcamps numbered at least 169. Gross-Rosen, the one in Lower Silesia, held 77,000 prisoners in over 100 subcamps. The vast majority by 1944 were focused on forced labor, Zwangsarbeit in German, forced labor, all under the direction of a major SS office called the Economic and Administration Central Office. I'll say it to you in German, but I won't. The vast majority of these camps were established in the final 18 months of World War II. I mean, if you look at this map, all of those dots don't represent the total. We'd need a much larger map to figure that out. Notice on the side there that by this point, in December of 1944, there are 44,000 camps. This is why the Encyclopedia Project at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has been going on for several years, and it is vast. It's numerous volumes. It's not just dealing with camps, it's dealing with ghettos, but nonetheless, it is vast. But this gives you at least some flavor, this map does, of how many there are. And what you don't see on this map is that the camps also go up on the Baltic, and the camps also go down into Italy and Croatia farther down here. So there's more than what you can see here. But even if it were just this map, there would be more than you could see on this map. Now, note, the expansion of the subcamp system is really inextricably connected with the gradual collapse of Nazi Germany. The last year of the war, say from the spring of 1944 until the ultimate collapse of Nazi Germany, you see a dramatic increase in the number of camps and in the number of prisoners. And this, ironically, this is in the twilight of the Third Reich, when the borders of the Nazi Empire are contracting. The number of camps is growing, and the number of prisoners absolutely balloons. In the West, there are two main camps. One not very well known, Herzogenbusch. It's not even on this map here. It's in Holland. Many of you have heard of Westerbork, which was a transit camp. Many of the people know about it largely because that's the camp that the Anne Frank's family went through. But there's another camp that was controlled by the Economic Administrative Headquarters Office, and it closes down in September of 1944, as did the camp called Natzweiler, which is close to France. Why did they close down? Well, of course, the Allies are coming from the West at this point, and roughly 6,000 prisoners are then transported to Dachau. Now, this takes place in a very, very orderly fashion. These are orderly evacuations. They did not cause mass death. That doesn't mean that people didn't die in the evacuations, but there was a massive death in this. Now, at the same time, initial evacuations in the Baltic states were often very disorderly, very problematic. The camps are much larger than those in the western part of Germany or the one in Holland. And the advance of the Soviet forces has become very unpredictable. The Nazis don't know how they're going to deal with the Red Army as it gradually encloses in on the Baltic states. So the retreat from places like Vivara was a major camp here. The Riga camp, which is also called Kaiserwald here, is also a major camp. And there's a major camp in Kovno in Lithuania. These were not orderly. The retreat from these camps was hasty, it was brutal, lots of people died. Nevertheless, the retreat from Majdanek is today in eastern Poland. If you know where Lublin is, you know basically where Majdanek is, because they're very close. This was fairly orderly. It was planned by the Economic and Administrative Headquarters Office in late 1943. The camp was abandoned on the 22nd of June 1944, with the Red Army gradually approaching. This camp was the first first significant camp that was liberated by the Red Army. Okay. However, it's the final months of the war, from January to right up until early May of 1945, which I think is crucial for understanding the view of the camps that has become more popularized at the point of liberation. On the 12th of January, 1945, the Red Army launches a devastating offensive. I tried to find a more simplified map than this. Forgive me that I couldn't. But everything in white here is where the Red Army is now active. Okay, you can see where Krakow is down here. You can see where Warsaw is right here, and of course you can see where Danzig is up here. So you can get a sense of how close they are. Okay, this is the 12th of January. Understanding what happens here is important. Soviet tanks broke through on a vast front on this particular day. The Wehrmacht, the German military, lost a foothold on Polish territory, and literally, and keep this in mind, literally millions of German civilians are in mass flight to the west. Now, what you need to know is much of this territory had been Polish before 1939. The plan, and like I said before, nobody goes to war with the plan that they're going to lose. The plan was to settle Germans in this territory, and there were lots of Germans that had moved into this area, not necessarily from the old Reich, but brought in. They were what were referred to as Volksdeutsch, people who had German ancestry, but were settled in the Baltic states, or maybe were settled in Yugoslavia or in Romania, or in some cases very deep into the Soviet Union. In fact, there's a group called the Volga-Deutsch that were settled near the Volga River, just to give you a sense of how deep into the Soviet Union Germans were. And before Hitler invades the Soviet Union, there was a deal basically made between Hitler and Stalin to ship all of these Volksdeutsch into these newly inhabited areas that were Poland, that are now part of Germany. So now the Red Army is coming. These poor people have lived here for maybe 2 or 3 years, and now they're being forced to move west into the Reich. So the roads are cluttered with people, millions of people. And these are civilians, but you also have the military. And now you have what we come to know as the death marches. 3 giant camps stand in the way here. Stutthof, which I've mentioned, is up near Danzig. There are approximately 50,000 prisoners in Stutthof at the beginning of January 1945. Auschwitz is roughly 40 miles west of Krakow, and there are approximately 70,000 prisoners there in January. Gross Rosen, a camp that is much deeper into Lower Silesia. It's a little bit farther to the west of Breslau. Breslau was a major German city that's now known as Wrocław, a city in Poland. And there are 77,000 prisoners associated with Gross Rosen. So we've got thousands upon thousands of prisoners that they're trying to determine what to do with. Approximately 150,000 are on the road in January of 1945. Okay, we'll focus briefly on Auschwitz here. The gassings at Auschwitz-Birkenau, this is often also referred to as Auschwitz II or simply as Birkenau. The gassings ended in October of 1944. This doesn't mean that the killings stop, okay? You don't need gas to kill, okay? But the gassings end. The plan, in fact, is to dismantle the gas chambers and ship them near Mauthausen in Austria. Approximately 70,000 prisoners on the 1st of January still are there. That, by the way, is a reduction by 100,000 from what it was in July of 1944. A dramatic increase. Now, keep in mind that in July of 1944, you have literally tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews that are arriving daily. Remember, when Zev arrives, that's in June of 1944. So this is when the mass of people are coming from Hungary, more people than had ever been seen in Auschwitz. The evacuations begin on the 17th of January. This is a photo that is a photo of the evacuations, and I'm guessing, it wasn't clear, but I'm guessing this may have been taken very early, maybe even on the 17th, because these prisoners don't look that bad at this point. They're going to look much worse. Of course, the prisoners that were very sick weren't taken. They were left. They were left. Remaining in the camp, mostly in what's called the Stammlager. This is the smaller camp, but the main camp that has Auschwitz macht frei, or excuse me, Arbeit macht frei over the gate. Birkenau, the extermination camp, or Monowitz. Monowitz is the camp, the labor camp that was associated with I.G. Farben. I.G. Farben, many of you probably are aware, was working on synthetic rubber and the possibility of making synthetic fuel, something that the Germans desperately needed. So 10 days pass with these 7,000 roughly prisoners there. For prisoners, these were, as Waxman says, these were days of peril and promise. One prisoner stated that they were the most difficult days in the more than 5 years that I spent in the camp. From the 20th or 21st of January, these inmates started finally to rule themselves. They broke into SS storehouses that were left in the camp. They cut holes into the barbed wire. There was one group of French prisoners in the camp who went into the SS dining room, and an SS patrol came by and killed them all. in the dining room. So that's why this is a time of peril and promise. And aside from the Nazi killers, you have to keep in mind that this is the end of January. By the way, the end of January 1945 was much colder than it is in 2023. And so you've got the cold, you have hunger, you have disease, and these, obviously, this is taking its toll. When the Soviet soldiers arrive on the 27th of January, some of the prisoners ran to them, and the stories are there. We hugged them, we kissed them. This was Otto Vulcan who wrote this a few months later. We cried with joy. We were saved. Now, death on the roads and on the rails. This is the best photograph I could get of the prisoners who are being, after they have been marched, they are being loaded into these cars. Now, take a look at this. These are open cars. This is January into February, and they're being loaded into these cars to be transported further to the west into the Old Reich. Over the following 3 months, the concentration camp system is in perpetual motion. Perpetual motion. No one knows with precision how many prisoners died during these evacuations. They died on the icy roads. They were crammed into these open rail cars, and many of them froze to death in these rail cars. They died in ditches. They died in the forests. They died in deserted barns, because remember, lots of people have left their homes, and there are places that you might try to get warm or hide. Now, while the popular memory is dominated to some degree by these death marches. Whoops, that's a picture I wanted to show you a bit ago. This was the date. This was when the Red Army liberated these prisoners. And this has obviously been touched up. You can see that if you look closely at it, but it's not a bad photo to show you that you have Soviet medical personnel now taking a look and examining the prisoners that they find when they get to Birkenau and the Stammlager. So what you see here is changing constantly. It's changing constantly. Now, while popular memory has people marching all the time, or they're not marching is probably the wrong word, just barely walking along the roads, many of the people were in fact in these rail cars, especially from the east. Now, when you get into the movement in camps in Germany, it's different. Okay. Many of them are marching between one camp or another, going from a sub-camp to a main camp, back to another sub-camp. The SS isn't quite sure what to do with them all. The journey from the east, however, was done mostly by rail. But this trip, in many cases, was far worse than any earlier evacuation that had been done in 1944. All the horror of the concentration camps were packed into these train carriages. With the rolling stock in short supply, the authorities had to use these open cars. There was nothing else that they had available to them. No protection against the elements, and they're suffering through these extraordinary delays as they go along. The trains are crawling along because, of course, this is a country that is collapsing in the midst of the Second World War here. The routes are congested with the German railway network crumbling. One train left an Auschwitz satellite camp called Laura Hütte on January 23rd and moved so excruciatingly slow, coming to a standstill in many cases, that it didn't reach Mauthausen until 1 week later. And 1 in 7 on board the train were dead by that particular point. Now, of course, the ordeal begins with the death marches, and these claimed a good deal of victims, probably the majority of the victims in the winter months of 45. And I'm not just talking about those from the east, but those marching around within Germany. They received very little food. Upon leaving Auschwitz, they received 2 largely inedible loaves of bread, if you could call it that, and 1 tin of beef, and that was to last them the whole time. Privileged prisoners received more, and this was a piece of the concentration camp system. Privileged prisoners, capo, people who were in charge of other prisoners, received more. More food, shoes, warmer clothing, where others staggered along in rags and wooden clogs, many of them collapsing. Rudolf Huss is the one in the more brownish photograph here. He was dispatched by Oswald Pohl. Pohl was in charge of the Economic and Administrative Central Office. He was dispatched by Huss to monitor the evacuations. And he recorded that it was very easy to follow the individual tracks. All you had to do was follow along the dead bodies, so you knew where they were going. The death rates on the marches vary greatly, and this often was linked to supplies and the distance that people had to travel. Illness, exhaustion, hunger were the main causes of death. Shootings were always endemic, always part of something you need to be worried about. But they weren't systematic. You just didn't know when they were going to happen. Most of the victims died some lonely death as a result of dying from sheer exhaustion. But there were some large-scale massacres. For example, there was a massacre of Sikh when they were marching out of Bleckhammer. Bleckhammer was one of the satellite camps of Auschwitz. The victims in this case were loaded up onto sledges, and they were killed with hand grenades. They were sick and they couldn't get away. Few of the killers at this stage were senior camp officers. That is an important point to make. These people are no longer being ordered to do this by people who are their seniors. Okay? Most of the senior officers had already fled west. They weren't part of this process. In practice, and this is noted by Waxman, each guard decided what he or she, and in some cases it was she, was going to do. Fear of the Red Army drove many of the lesser perpetrators. With the Third Reich collapsing as it was, and with the area awash with stories of revenge by Soviet soldiers for the way that humanity had been treated in the Soviet Union by the Nazis, you do have a terrific amount of anxiety and fear amongst the people that are marching to the west. The largest massacre was prompted by guards' desire to escape the enemy. For example, 3,000 Stutthof prisoners, that's the camp up near Danzig, mostly Jewish women, were trapped in East Prussia by the Baltic on one side and the Soviets on the other. And they were mowed down by machine guns, basically right along the beach of the Baltic here. The wounded prisoners either froze to death or they drowned in the sea. These last months are really devastating. Now, only during the 5 weeks that begin the beginning of April to the early part of May do you actually see the collapse of the concentration camp system. The Economic and Administrative Head Office disbanded in late April, just disbanded, after the Allies had reached most of the remaining satellite or main camps. Buchenwald and Dora, Mittelbau, were reached on the 11th of April. Bergen-Belsen, which is represented by these 3 photographs, was liberated by the British on the 15th of April. Margot and Anna Frank had died in March in this camp. The British found more than 13,000 bodies just strewn across the compound. I'm horrified every time I think about that little boy walking by all those dead bodies and the memory that this must have had for him. Approximately 55,000 survivors died in the following days. 55,000 who were alive at liberation. We had, Anna Tilton, who's here, will remember this. We had a survivor who was liberated at Bergen-Belsen named David Faber, who said if they had come one day later, he'd have been dead. One day later. And there's a photograph of him that it's just amazing to think that he survived. In any case, they died by the hundreds. They died by the hundreds in the following days. Sachsenhausen was liberated. Sachsenhausen is just north of Berlin on the 22nd and 23rd of April. Flossenbürg was one of the quarry camps in eastern Bavaria, was liberated on the 23rd of April. Dietrich Bonhoeffer had been executed on the 9th of April in Flossenbürg. Dachau was liberated on the 29th of April. That's important because that was the first concentration camp, dating from March of 1933. Neuengamme was liberated on the 2nd of May. Mauthausen was liberated on the 4th. And Stutthof, the one up near Danzig, was liberated on the 9th, which is the day after the war ended. So in well over 100 camps, the Allied soldiers found prisoners that were left by the SS. But their numbers varied dramatically. No two camps were alike. Sometimes you'd find a handful of prisoners in these satellites. Now, the satellite camps, some of them could be quite large, but some of them were remarkably small. Some of them would be smaller than the size of half of a football field. Small places that were guarded maybe by a couple of people. But they were needed for labor, and that was the reason that were created. But again, there were over 55,000 that were in Bergen-Belsen at the end. Approximately 250,000 survivors are liberated between the 1st of April and the end of the war on the 8th of May. 25 to 30,000 died by the end of May. Of those liberated, 25 to 30,000 died. Died of typhus or died from being so malnourished that they simply could not be kept alive. And in some cases, and this is one of the tragedies of this, they were fed too much by soldiers that were trying to take care of them, but didn't know what they were doing. The Neuengamme was a huge compound which was completely empty when the Brits arrived there. And so you have the countless transports crisscrossing what is a shrinking Reich. This is the way things looked when the war ended. The only territory that is controlled by the Nazi regime at this point is in the dark red. So the ability to move prisoners has become remarkably tiny. I want to point out a piece of this right up in this area. This is Schleswig-Holstein, the province that is just south of Denmark here. Tens of thousands then die before they could be reached. I think one should view the death transports as kind of the last act of the concentration camp system. Not necessarily the last act of the Holocaust, because the transports and the marches, they're dominated by Camp SS personnel. And these personnel are quite used to the murdering process. In general, the marches and the transports really ended up quickening trends that were already there in the concentration camp system. Nonetheless, the camp structure becomes now much more dynamic. Prisoners are now perpetually on the move, something that had not been the case over the last 4 years. Without senior leaders, the perpetrators gain a great deal more autonomy. Killing with impunity becomes much more common than it had been. Yet the killing is not necessarily focused on Jewish prisoners. Indeed, Daniel Blotman, the Israeli historian, notes that the perpetrators became much more diverse. They're loyal Nazis, to be sure, but they're also opportunists. They sometimes ordinary civilians, in fact, are killing out of fear. I mean, people come out of their home and end up killing people that they don't know. And it's because they worry about the retribution that might come back to them if these people stay alive. This is one of the horrors, I would suggest, attached to the Second World War, and maybe attached to war in general. Those who murdered were not inevitably anti-Semitic. And indeed, those that were killed were not necessarily Jews. Jews represented roughly 40% of the prisoners that were on these death marches. The victims, victims as an object of ideology becomes a blurred issue by the end of the war. In late April, the SS camp leaders and other key administrators gather in Flensburg. When I pointed out on the map, that's approximately where Flensburg is. It's up kind of north of Lübeck, if you know where Lübeck is in Germany, and not too far south of the Danish border. These were, I have to suggest, the most blinkered of Nazi officials at this particular point. These are the die-hard elite of the Third Reich as represented by the SS. They're still committed to the cause, by way of this idea that we can have some kind of a fortress north. Many of us have heard of a fortress maybe down in the Alps in Bavaria. Well, these people think of a fortress up north. As Hitler's empire now lays in ruins, as its Führer has already committed suicide, among those assembled were the party leaders from the concentration camp inspectorate. People such as Rudolf Höss, the former Auschwitz commander, Richard Glucks, who was the head of the inspectorate of the concentration camps, a fellow named Enno Lolling, who was the Dachau camp doctor, a very vicious man. All of these people are gathering now up in Flensburg. You also have former camp commandants, besides Rudolf Höss here. Max Pauli, who was the commander of Neuengamme, Anton Keindl of Sachsenhausen, Fritz Sören of Ravensbrück, Paul Werner Hoppe of Stutthof. These are all former camp commanders. They're all chiefly drawn to Flensburg due to the presence of Heinrich Himmler, who made his way north to Flensburg to meet with his men on the 3rd and 4th of May, 1945. It will be their final meeting together. What did they anticipate? Did they anticipate some phantom vision that Himmler might offer up to them in order to go down maybe in some blaze of glory? It's not clear. It's not clear. However, Himmler announced when he gathered them together that he had no more directives. for the concentration camp system. He dismissed his underlings with a handshake, and he directed them to disguise themselves and to go into hiding. So what happened? Many of them followed Hitler in suicide. Glucks killed himself with a cyanide capsule on the 10th of May, so just about 6 days later. Himmler died of a cyanide capsule on the 23rd of May, after having been captured by the British. Enno Lulling died on the 27th of May in the same way. Max Pauli hung himself on the 8th of October, 1946. Fritz Sören hanged himself in 1950, on the 8th of June. Rudolf Höss was hung by the Poles in 1947. One of these men, Paul van der Hoppe, survived until 1974. Nicholas Waxman ends his book, KL, with a story from Dachau. Dachau, again, as I pointed out, liberated by Americans on the 29th of April. By the way, I've read there's a headline in the New York Times on the 1st of May, 1945, in which it says that the most notorious death camp, Dachau, was liberated on the 29th. I'm sure that the people at New York Times know better now than to use that particular term for it. This story centers on a fellow named Moritz Koinowski, a Polish-born Jew. Koinowski was arrested by the Gestapo on the 28th of September, 1939. This is shortly after the war begins. He was arrested in his adopted hometown of Magdeburg, not terribly far from Berlin. He was a very successful tailor. He handed over everything he owned. He was given a convict's uniform with a yellow and red triangle. The red triangle was because he had been a member of the Social Democratic Party. He was taken to Buchenwald, where he survived for 3 years. Survived 3 years of forced labor in a lethal quarry. He was subjected to repeated corporal punishment. He received 25 lashes 3 times. Then he survived his first mass selection at Auschwitz, where he was then sent. He had arrived there on the 19th of October, 1942, with 400 other prisoners from Buchenwald. He survived 2 more selections over the next couple of years at Monowitz, which is where he was working, that might have saved his life to be in a work detail at Monowitz. But all of this is during the height of the Holocaust. And despite illness, despite starvation, despite beatings and serious injuries, he then survives a transport via Gross-Rosen to Dachau, where he arrives on the 28th of January, 1945. To imagine this guy surviving all of this is quite remarkable. During that transport, an SS bullet, he was shot at by the SS, and it just missed his head, but it ripped his ear off. He then survived the final 3 months of forced labor at Dachau. Despite emaciation, sickness, he contracted typhus, which was incredibly common. Thousands died of typhus at Dachau. More died in those 4 months at Dachau than had died over the previous years that Dachau had existed of typhus. Moritz Koinowski had survived over 2,000 days in the concentration camp system. Very unique, okay? And this is all recorded by a man who became his friend, a fellow by the name of Edgar Kupfer, who was the first chronicler of Dachau. He wrote the story of that camp originally. Theodor Zev Weiss died in November of 2020. In this picture, he's with a couple of friends and colleagues, Jonathan Papadopoulos and Wendy Lauer. Petropoulos, excuse me. I began with the story of this 13-year-old boy, Zev. Zev Weiss, rescued from a ditch outside of Gunskirchen, one of the Mauthausen satellites, rescued by an American soldier who happened to be a Quaker and a medic. He asked this guy when he got well why he had picked him up and taken him and commanded them to take care of him. And the fellow said to him, "My mother told me that if I ever passed someone in need and did nothing, I was no longer her son." That has haunted me ever since I heard Zev tell me that. So what was the course of his life? Until 1976, first of all, he went back to his hometown, and I pointed out on that map, very far to the east, northeast in Hungary, where he was violently chased out by Hungarians when he got there. So he tried to enter Palestine. He was forbidden to enter by the British. He immigrated in 1947 to Canada. He attended McGill University. He moved to Rochester, New York in 1956 to teach at a synagogue school. From 1971, he served as the educational director of an academy in Wilmette, Illinois. With a group of friends, he established the Holocaust Educational Foundation in 1976, beginning with a project of videotaping survivor testimonies. From the mid-'80s, he began to focus on adding the Holocaust into college history departments. The first such course was launched in 1988 at Northwestern. It was taught by Peter Hayes, someone who delivered the Holocaust Memorial Lecture at Keene State College, somebody who became a close friend. Then Zev did something that is just remarkable, and it is so Zev. He traveled from San Diego to Orono, Maine, going to colleges, looking up history departments, finding out who taught modern European history. And he was a virtuoso of persuasion. And more than 400 colleges and universities now offer Holocaust courses, either directly or indirectly associated with the work of Zev Weiss. He launched the conference, Lessons and Legacies, in 1989. And he began the Summer Institute for Holocaust and Jewish Civilization in 1991. This is a 2-week program that's taught at Northwestern. It's often called the Holocaust Boot Camp. It's very demanding. The students of that program include everyone from graduate students to full professors. It includes Judaism, and it takes a very multidisciplinary approach to the Holocaust. So you're reading literature, you're studying art, you're thinking about music and so forth, and film. He began the Eastern European Studies Seminar in the mid-90s, in which a faculty were able to go to Eastern Europe and visit the camps and visit the sites of the ghettos. My experience was I attended the 2000 Summer Institute, and I participated in the 2001 Eastern European Seminar, and I presented as well at the Lessons and Legacies Conference. More important from my perspective is what he did helped inspire the creation of a minor and a major at Keene State College in Holocaust Studies. Zev was In fact, Zev was the Holocaust Memorial Lecturer in 2001. There's no redemption. Nothing can redeem the Holocaust. But Zev's determination, I think, demonstrates the power of the good. And it's linked to the compassion of an American soldier. That's it. Thank you. Thank you.
If anybody has any questions, I'll bring you the microphone.
Yeah, please.
We know where the main camps are because some of them still have the ruins. But all of these smaller camps, what eventually happened to them? Are any of them still extant, or are they all just completely erased?
There are. It's.
Repeat the question for the.
Yeah. Okay. Please. Yes. We know where the main camps are because some of them have been memorialized. Basically, Auschwitz is a memorial site. And you can go to Bergen-Belsen, you can go to Dachau, you can go to Buchenwald, you can find where these camps are. How about all these others? By far, most of them have disappeared. If we're talking about 44,000 camps that were in many cases subcamps of subcamps, they have disappeared. However, I was in Einbeck. As many of you know, Keene is a sister partner city with Einbeck, Germany. And while I was visiting there one time, I've been there about half dozen times now, I was taken by one of the people who sings with Voices, the group that we made an exchange with. And he took me out to a place where there was a camp. It was out in the woods, and there are little signs there showing that this is where the French prisoners were. This is where the Hungarian prison, whatever it is, and you can still see where these places are. Now that took some doing on somebody's part. They decided they needed to track this down. I had a student many years ago who was German and was taking some courses with me, and she went home. And she became a bit of a pest and found out something about the camp that was in the local area. There was a movie about this at one point called The Nasty Girl, I think, who started to track down what had happened in her town and where were the villages, where were the camps where these things were located. But they're hard to find. And, you know, given the fact that we're so far now from the Second World War, much of this has disappeared. If you go to Birkenau today, you see only a fraction of what was there, because whereas the Stammlager, the main camp, had brick buildings, Birkenau had wooden buildings. And in the immediate aftermath of the war, after liberation, there were Poles who needed that wood to keep warm. And they ripped many of these places down. And it took a while before they could finally decide, wait a minute, we can't allow this to go on. We need to have some structure here. And so when you walk through the camp, you'll see chimneys. You'll see a lot of chimneys, but you won't see any building around them. Well, you need to use your imagination. There were buildings around them. But when you're talking about tiny places, when I did the Eastern European Studies seminar, we went to all the camps. I mean, we went to the site of Chełmno, and we went to Treblinka, then we went to Majdanek and Belzec. Belzec was an extermination camp that was incredibly efficient. Boy, it killed hundreds of thousands. It is so small. It is not much larger than this building. It's quite remarkable. And you need to note that people were not sent there to work. They were sent there to die. So there was no need to have a vast complex. So when you think about the extermination camps as opposed to a concentration camp, where you are concentrating hundreds, if not thousands of people, there's a difference there. And that site has now been memorialized in a way that wasn't the case when I visited it. I actually found a piece of bone on the ground when I was there, and I was horrified. And it didn't hit me until that evening at dinner, and I just completely broke down. You can't fight, it's been paved over now, so that wouldn't happen now. But it was so raw. It was so raw when I was there. So I hope that helps.
Thanks, Peter. Let's have one last question from Jay, and then maybe some final comments from Rabbi Dan.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Dr. Vincent.
Dr. Cohen.
Thank you. So I may ask you to venture beyond the realm of history into that of psychology. But I, like Peter, have family background here, and it is remarkable, 44,000 camps. And while I've been privileged to see some restorative justice in a second generation beyond the Holocaust victims, the first generation, those who were engaged, found an ability to deny the presence of these 44,000 or in their neighborhoods, in their towns, and that to me is remarkable. It really stifled any kind of dialogue post World War II of how people were influenced, how people could ignore, and so I'm wondering, have you some reflections on how that basic element within Germany, largely the labor camps, but as you've demonstrated, spread all over, but how they could be denied and perhaps pushed back in people's memories and thoughts to that I had no idea that this was happening.
I hope, do you want me to repeat that? There's a lot there. The first generation, how were they treated? Restitution ultimately comes, but the first generation, I spoke of a guy named Moritz Kornowski. His story, I think, is illustrative of what you're asking about. As is Zev's. Zev's comes out a bit better, but his attempt to go back to his hometown was obviously unsuccessful. And it is a characteristic of what happened to almost everyone who tries to do that in Eastern Europe. It could be Poland, it could be Hungary, it could be Czechoslovakia. It was not good. Kornowski, despite the fact that he was obviously an incredibly strong man who has managed to stand up to this, he had problems the rest of his life. One of his arms he couldn't raise any longer. He received all of those lashes, and the scars continuously became infected over time, and he was constantly having to get treatment for them. He ends up coming to America, but he can't find good work because he's so weak. He can't he can't be a tailor anymore, and so he works in a laundry. He does things that it's just pitiful because in the 50s people are not recognizing this, whether it's in Germany or the United States. They're just not recognizing the significance of survivors. And I do think it takes time for people to make this kind of, it's tragic. It's more than tragic. But it takes time for people to make that adjustment to saying, oh my God, look what happened. And it's not just this, it's not just the Holocaust. It's any kind of an event like this. I think it takes time for people to suddenly realize what it was that happened. What it was that happened. I'll not forget when they had the 50th anniversary of the D-Day invasion. And those of you who have taken World War II from me know this story, where this unit goes back and they look up the Pont de Hoc, and one of them says, which they climbed to knock out a gun emplacement up at the top. And one asks the other, how did we do this? How did we do this? And I think when that happens in 1994, people become much more aware of what happened with this particular generation. They weren't called the greatest generation in the 1950s. They were called the greatest generation in the 1990s. You know, I think Tom Brokaw owns a lot of property in Montana now because he found the right moment to write The Greatest Generation. You know, he couldn't have done that in the 1970s. Smart man. But the fact is, the Germans have learned a terrific amount. They have recognized their past much better than others, much better than the Poles, much better than the Austrians, much better. The French started to make a turn in the 1990s, but it took them quite a bit longer. And you have to respect them for that. Contemplate a memorial to the Holocaust placed right next to the Brandenburg Gate, with a museum underground right now. But we're talking about the center of Berlin. It took decades for that to happen, but it happened. And it is a statement to the world about our recognition of what we're responsible for. Took time. Yeah, could I take one minute? I've got a hand back here. Yeah.
One more.
Yeah.
Let me bring you the microphone.
I just had the opportunity to to read a book by a fellow named Jonathan Freeland, and it's called The Escape Artist. It's over 500 pages, and it answers many of the questions about the Holocaust being a big secret during World War II. And this man was an escapee from Auschwitz, and he was trying to get the word out to the Jewish communities in all of the countries in Europe to beware of what the Germans were doing, because the Germans were saying they're going to relocate them and they're going to take them to workplaces. So he was trying to get this word out, and he couldn't. And he tried to get it out to the embassies of all of the countries in Europe, and they weren't paying attention. These concentration camps could have been obliterated and stopped just by simply bombing the railroads that were carrying the people to them. And he couldn't even get that message across. There's something that went wrong there throughout those 4 or 5 years of the war that resulted in 3 million people dying needlessly.
There's a PBS film that just came out that's focused on the topic that you're talking about. I can't remember the name of the series. Some of you maybe have seen this, but it's was just no, not Ken Burns. This was in fact, Nicholas Voxman, who I mentioned in this, is a central figure in this. I disagree with some of what you said here. But no, I know the story of River Vox and Weitzel, who escaped from Auschwitz and who brought all the information and had it all typed up in Slovakia. And then people wouldn't even the Jewish community would not listen to him. In fact, the Jewish community that was not that far by rail between Hungary and Auschwitz. The Nazis demonstrated time and time again that they did not need gas chambers and concentration camps to mass murder people. They killed 18,000 on the 3rd of November, 1943, in something called the Erntefest, the Harvest Festival. Great name for a mass murder, just outside of Majdanek. They just lined them up and massacred them. Never in any day of Auschwitz were 18,000 people killed. And I think it's important to note that every time they bombed railway tracks in France in preparation for the invasion of Normandy, it took them less than 48 hours to repair those tracks. They were up and going again. So there are certain things that could be done. The bombing of Auschwitz would not have ended the Holocaust. The bombing of Auschwitz would have at least told those people there that they hadn't been forgotten. And that, to me, is a different kind of issue. Okay? But we have to remember that we were engaged in the Second World War at the time. We have to remember that there was a death march in the Philippines that included thousands of American troops that were not released for a long time. We had to defeat the Japanese in order to get them home. And my father was on one of the hospital ships that brought them back to the West Coast. World War II was an incredible tragedy within which is the Holocaust. One of the things that Gerhard Weinberg, one of my most adored professors, who's now in his 90s and who got out of Germany in 1938, not via the Kindertransport, but because he had a relative in England. He said, during the first 20 years or so after the war, virtually every history of the Second World War, if it mentioned the Holocaust, it was in a paragraph or even a footnote. Gradually, especially after, I think it was an NBC series called The Holocaust in the 1970s, people became much more aware of this. Germans, as well as the world at large. And I think that's important to note because this had an impact in Germany. There are problems with that series, but that series woke a lot of people up. And I think it was very important. Gerhard, when he spoke, and this was a talk that he gave at Lessons and Legacies, he said, the problem now is people write books about the Holocaust and they forget that the Second World War was happening. Now, he said this about 20 years ago. It's like the Second World War has now become the footnote, and the Holocaust that has changed. Doris Bergen is a terrific historian who has written about the war and genocide in one book, and I think it's important for them to be together. But we need to recognize that they are totally interconnected with one another. So, with that, I will follow David's lead. Thank you.